that's right. And over here is more or less the end of the transition. No one alive in the world today has experienced truly pre-transitional circumstances, truly pre-transitional conditions. Indeed, I think it is hard for any of us here to really imagine what truly pre-transitional circumstances would be like. And yet these were the circumstances that prevailed everywhere 250 years ago or so. However, perhaps 20 to 30% of births would be dead before reaching their first birthday. 20 to 30% dead before their first birthday. Events, crises like epidemics in particular, but also sometimes famines, were so frequent that adults could never be very sure that they would survive from one year to the next. And women might have, I don't know, 5, 6, perhaps even 7 live births during the course of their reproductive lives. So, what do we take from that? The first thing is that life was highly uncertain for everyone. Women's lives in particular were dominated by childbearing, pregnancy, lactation. And the fact that fertility per woman was high ensured that the age structure of the population was young. So before the transition over here, we're dealing with young population age structures primarily because of high levels of fertility. Now, in contrast, if we think about post-transitional conditions, conditions after the demographic transition, then it's very easy for us to imagine what those conditions are like because they characterize the society, for example, this society here. Life is much more secure, very much more secure. Indeed, very few deaths occur below age 50. Only a tiny number, particularly in comparative terms. Women may have a couple of births, perhaps less, during the course of their reproductive lives. And the fact that fertility is low means that the age structure of the population is now old. So it is the fertility decline of the demographic transition, above all, which is responsible for population aging. It would account for why, for example, the population of the Netherlands now is much older than it was 250 years ago. Okay, now, in many respects, in fact, I think in an awful lot of respects, the demographic transition is a very good thing. It's an extremely positive phenomenon. And I'll say some things about that a little bit later. When we come to a post-transitional circumstance, or as populations move through this transition, so people's hold on life, their grasp on life, becomes much stronger. And another important aspect of the transition is that it represents a huge increase in the efficiency of reproduction. So to illustrate this, if we go back to circumstances before the transition, and I'm simplifying because we have to, if we go back to this sort of situation here, then a woman might have to have 6 births in order for 2 of them to survive into adulthood. But after the transition, they can essentially achieve exactly the same result by just having 2 births, both of which will survive. So it's an incredible increase in the efficiency of reproduction. Moreover, notice from what I've said that there is little difference in, I'm simplifying again here, there is little difference in net fertility before the transition and after the transition. Because roughly, I underline the word roughly, two adults produce 2 births, or less, both before and after, but not during the transition. So in technical terms, net fertility is fairly similar before and after this stylized transition. However, another characteristic of the transition, which is shown, of course, in this stylized diagram, is that the death rate comes down before the birth rate. And this means that there is a very long period when the birth rate is higher than the death rate, and therefore the transition always involves a lengthy period of population growth. Now, what do I mean by a lengthy period? I'm doing some work on this. It's a matter of judgment. But I think if you look at most European transitions, which are now complete, essentially you're looking at something that's 2 centuries long, perhaps 250 years long. It depends how you define the start of the transition. But we're dealing with 200 years, more or less, at least. But if you look at most modern transitions, you're dealing with a shorter transitions. I would say, very roughly speaking, probably 100 to 150 years in length. But that's my judgment. And it rests, amongst other things, upon accepting projections, because very few other populations have actually gone through the whole transition. Moreover, at the level of individual couples, at the level of individual men and women, couples, there is a correspondingly long period during which there is an increase in average family size, if you like, an increase in net fertility, mainly because fewer children die as mortality comes down, that is, as the death rate comes down first within the transition there in our stylized diagram. Now, importantly in this context, and I think this is important for those of us who believe very firmly in family planning, importantly in this context, the lagged adoption of birth control, it is lagged, by the way, but it's birth control essentially which brings down the birth rate here in the second part of the transition, that top curve there. The lagged adoption of birth control that leads to the reduction of the birth rate can be seen as an attempt to maintain family size rather than decrease it. I owe that phrasing to David Reher, who's an American demographer based in Madrid. But he says that. The adoption of birth control within the transition can be seen as an attempt to maintain family size to what it was originally, rather than to decrease it. And I think that's a very valuable way of thinking about the case, if you like, for family planning and the adoption of birth control. Okay. Now, in a few places, other than Europe, but particularly in Europe, the transition is now complete. Okay? But in the rest of the world, it began much later, often in the 20th century, and it's still happening to varying degrees today. So this is a massive phenomena that is gradually unfolding, if you like to look at it, everywhere in differing ways. And so here we have the data that I was able to find for the Netherlands, and you can certainly see, I hope, the correspondence, no, sorry, stick with the Netherlands, yeah, for a moment. You can certainly see, I hope, well, there is the country's individual history in the individual years, and as I typed them in, some of the years meant things to me. The rate would go up or down in a particular way. But although that is the individual history of the Netherlands, it's also the demographic transition. And it also shows you the same general form that we were looking